Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Radio. And in today's podcast edition, we're going to be discussing area control. If you've listened to the previous podcasts, you would have seen that we kind of warming up towards this position. We've gone through aerodrome, approach, and now we're up to area. When you start talking about area control, you're talking about a specific class of aircraft. This aircraft is able to reach higher levels than most. So we're dealing normally in the medium to heavy category aircraft. And to keep it simpler, we're dealing with aircraft that are pressurized and able to climb to a flight level that's going to assist them with en route travel. So what does this mean? Can't we compare it to approach control, where we also fly en route in a pressurized aircraft? The answer is yes, we can compare the two situations, but there are a few noticeable differences. Right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss area. It's also known as area control. The acronym for this or designator is Alpha Charlie Charlie ACC. The area controller does a lot of coordination with their colleague on approach. This would be for aircraft on the climb from the approach airspace into the area's airspace, and vice versa from the area airspace to the approach's airspace. But because the aircraft is flying over a longer distance than what would normally take place at lower flight levels, they're going to at some point reach a position where the controller, the area controller in this instance, who's managing that flight, is not able to continue giving positive control to that aircraft because they're leaving their region. Just like if you're going to drive along from one country to the next, at some point you reach a border control and you're going to go through, in this case, immigration, and you're going to get your passport stamped. And now you are in a new country once you've checked through customs. In area control's instance, you're not going to be checking through, or in this case, the pilot is not going to be checking through any customs, but he is going to be leaving one sector of control and get handed over to another sector of control while he's in an en route phase of flight. The area control's airspace, also known as the CTA, falls above the approach controller sector of airspace, which you would remember in the previous podcast on approach control is known as TMA, Terminal Control Area. So with this aircraft flying in the upper flight levels associated with that CTA and reaching this defined point where there's going to be a handover from one sector of area control to another sector of area control, the area controller that the pilot is currently speaking to will be responsible for coordinating the flight path, the flight plan, and the estimates which they already have at hand, because they're currently speaking to that aircraft under their control, and they will coordinate that with their neighboring country or sector to which this aircraft is going to be handed over to before that aircraft reaches that handover point. So there's going to be a set time that this has to take place, and the controller has to make sure that this information is coordinated accurately to the other controller. If the aircraft en route suddenly experiences turbulence, for example, and requests to change flight level, then once the flight level has been changed, the controller to whom this aircraft is currently under their control will then coordinate with the receiving controller, or the controller is going to be receiving this aircraft under their sector, and pass the updated information to them. Now we know that we're in 2021, we're part of next generation. We know that many countries in the world are controlling aircraft by radar. So you would probably be thinking, why do we need to coordinate this information if we already are speaking to the aircraft that we can see on radar, and the adjacent controller who is going to be receiving the control of this aircraft on handover can also see that aircraft. And this is true. However, if there's a radar failure, we still have to have a backup in place as the ATC managing this aircraft. As a recap, air traffic control is responsible for the safe, orderly, and expeditious flow of air traffic. So safety is paramount, and ATC needs to double up in the safety approach by writing this information down, whether they write it electronically or they write it by pen on a flight progress strip. They still need to pass this information to the controller to whom they're going to hand over to. This point of transfer of the aircraft from one area controller to the next area controller forms part of airspace known as flight information region. The term flight information region means that sector of airspace which falls under control of the service provider for that area concerned. Once the aircraft has been handed over from the one area controller to the next, should they be crossing the FIR, the flight information region, then they will be going over to another service provider. If the aircraft is staying within the flight information region, where the known service provider that they're currently speaking to is providing them with an air traffic control service, then they will merely be handed over from one area controller to the next within that flight information region. So there are handover points within a flight information region when an aircraft is flying within area control sector, and there are also handover points for the aircraft when it leaves the flight information region and where the aircraft crosses the flight information region and gets handed over to the next air traffic services provider. The air traffic controllers from alternate service providers are in coordination and communication with each other telephonically. Now, in the old air traffic control operation, the ATC would have been using a handheld telephone to also pass all this information to the next service provider, or they would have an assistant doing this for them. Nowadays, the air traffic controller is working from a headset with all the information fed to it electronically. So via a touchscreen display, they will be able to communicate not only with approach control, but with any other air traffic controllers in their sector, as well as the air traffic controllers from the adjacent flight information region. You might think that this air traffic controller has it easy because he's only speaking to aircraft that are in the cruise and that they're going to be handed over from one FR to the next. So does he only have to coordinate with another controller and then just simply monitor the aircraft on radar? Well, what else is this controller doing? It's not as easy as it sounds, because for area control, the term area is giving you a clue as to what type of airspace does this air traffic controller manage. They are managing an airspace of a greater volume than that of the approach controller, for example, with aircraft that are flying in the TMA. If you compare the area controller with the approach controller, remember, or just as a revision, the approach controller is controlling traffic within their TMA. The area controller is also controlling traffic within their CTA. But once the aircraft leaves the CTA, you're looking at from departure point at a distance of approximately 45 nautical miles, the aircraft is still under control of that ATC, which means that the area controller is not only controlling traffic within their CTA, they're also controlling traffic that's routing along what's known as an airway. And this airway is linking up one CTA to the next. So it's either linking up the CTA to another CTA within their FIR, or it's linking up the CTA in this FIR to the CTA in the adjacent FIR, based on the routing that the aircraft is following. When an aircraft is flying along an airway, they are receiving positive air traffic control service throughout. And the area controller responsible for the air traffic that's flying within their CTA and the airways, so the airway routes are separated both vertically and laterally with a minimum vertical spacing of 1,000 feet at all times. So the area controller working these mentioned airspaces has to ensure that aircraft speeds are adjusted where aircraft are flying along the same flight level, because aircraft can fly at the same flight level along an airway as long as their speeds are maintained. So aircraft speeds that are flying at the same flight level en route along an airway need to be monitored and adjusted where necessary to ensure that there's a lateral spacing between these aircraft of 10 nautical miles at all times. You can see just from this explanation that the area controller is monitoring a lot of information. And again, we're talking here about the ATC having the use of the radar. What about the area controller who is managing the same sector of airspace, but he's doing it without radar? Do you think that they can still manage this uninterrupted? Just like the ATC that is working in the TMA, working non-radar, so too would the area controller be able to manage the aircraft and keep them safe following a set guidance for what we call procedural control. You might also hear it being termed non-radar control. This is very possible, and there are sectors of airspace globally where air traffic control do not have radar coverage, most noticeably over the ocean as an example. In this instance, area control will manage the traffic from a non-radar perspective, and non-radar perspective is safer than radar in terms of the spacing. However, because we're working in non-radar and we can't see our aircraft, we cannot manage as many aircraft within our sector of airspace as we could when we are working with radar, just like the approach controller working in the TMA. So this, for example, would delay the aircraft on the ground so as to ensure that separation can be maintained between the number of aircraft flying within the CTA and the number of aircraft flying within the airway as managed by that area controller working non-radar. A person who works area control is normally someone we term a full book ATC. So this means that this air traffic controller more than likely started out as an assistant ATC, then became an aerodrome controller, worked their way through approach control, and then finally qualified as an area controller. Nowadays, air traffic service providers also allow ATC to specialize in a specific ATC career path. So not all ATCs are full book, and they may first become an assistant and then go direct towards becoming an area controller. This obviously depends on the needs of the service provider. If they have enough staff, which most service providers globally do not, then they will be able to put people into this specific category and let them specialize. Otherwise, they would prefer the ATC to be a full book so that they can use them on the roster for any one of those ATC positions. Out of interest for you, if the area controller is working one position for a long period, so for example, this podcast about area control, so if the area controller is working his shifts for a period of say 2 months or longer and are suddenly going to be rostered to now work in the tower as a tower controller or as a ground controller, then prior to that taking place, they will need to first get familiarized with the tower. So there would be an internal process which would take place, and they would be monitored by an OJTI, on the job training instructor, on the day of that shift for a particular period. So when we're talking about area control and we're talking about the airways, these airways are defined corridors routing from one navigational beacon to the next. Two types of navigation taking place. One is ground-based navigation and one is satellite-based navigation. The ground-based navigation is working off of equipment known as a VOR, VHF Omni-Range Radio, and this will facilitate the routing of the aircraft following the airway from one VOR to the next, and we would call that a reporting point. With satellite navigation, the airway will still be designed around a navigation route. However, the difference between satellite navigation and ground-based navigation is that the reporting point that has been designated along that airway using satellite technology cannot be seen. It would be designated by a name, just like we designate the VOR on the ground. But in this instance, when the aircraft reaches that reporting point, which has been defined on their flight computer, they will make the report that they're at that point, but they cannot see it. And that point is a designated point using satellite technology. When talking about ground-based navigation, the pilot may not necessarily see that VOR because he's already flying at a flight level which does not permit them to see that far. However, the ground-based navigation is a fixed piece of equipment on the ground. Okay, so that's just giving you a very brief explanation about area control management, flight information regions, airways, and CTAs. There are a host of other designators and procedures that fall within area control sector. This podcast was to make you aware of area control and how they fit into the big picture when we're talking about aerodrome approach and area control. Thank you for listening to today's podcast, and we hope that this brief introduction has given you insight into the ATC known as Area Controller. Talk again soon.